Born a slave, Frederick Douglass told the story of his life in 3 autobiographies and in hundreds of speeches, all working for the freedom of a people in bondage and ensuring that the details of their daily lives would never be forgotten.
I have never met with a slave who could tell me how old he was. Few slave mothers know anything of the months of the year, nor of the days of the month. They measure the ages of their children by springtime, wintertime, harvest time, planting time. Like other slaves, I cannot tell how old I am. My master allowed no questions to be put to him by which a slave could learn his age.
Knowing who you are, knowing where you came from, knowing your birth date, has to do with knowing your individual identity. For Douglass, knowing his birth date meant knowing who Douglass was, who Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was.
Here, Douglass spent the final years of his life in the house he named Cedar Hill, across the river from Washington, D.C. On a spring morning in 1894, a year before his death, he recorded the last entry in his diary. He described a trip to Baltimore to visit a relative of his old slave master. He was still in search of his birth date, a matter Douglass called a serious trouble.
I called yesterday while in Baltimore upon Dr. Thomas Sears and learned the following fact. Captain Aaron Anthony died November 14, 1823.
Working with the recorded death of his slave master, Douglass figured his own birth date as February 1817. But he was wrong. Years after Douglass died, the truth about the birth of the slave Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was discovered in a plantation ledger. Next to his slave name was the date, February 1818.
I'm starting to understand, I suspect, even within himself, how he got from there to here.
I am sitting here wanting memories to see the beauty.
The first experience of life with me that I now remember began in the family of my grandmother and grandfather. My grandmother enjoyed the high privilege of living in a cabin with no other burden but then her support and the necessary care of the little children. Living here with my dear old grandmother and grandfather, it was a long time before I knew myself to be a slave.
His grandmother is someone who interprets the world for him and helps him to understand what he sees.
It was turned over to old master, Aaron Anthony, manager of one of the largest plantations on the eastern shore. Y Plantation covered almost 10,000 acres, included 13 farms, and a workforce of more than 500 slaves.
The Y Plantation was completely self-sufficient, and that self-sufficiency depended on black hands. The blacksmiths, the carpenters, the people who worked in the fields, the coachmen, the cooks, the maids, the butlers. Everything that was done on the Y Plantation was done by black hands.
In the world into which Frederick Douglass was born, slavery was a time-honored American institution 200 years old. More than 1 million Africans and African Americans like himself were considered property. They were bought and sold and were bred like cattle. Frederick's mother died before he was 9 years old. He later wrote, her grave was like those lost at sea, without a marker or a stake. She died, he said, never revealing the identity of his father.
It could be the case that Douglass's father was an unknown man. He could have been an overseer. He could have been a white man who worked for the family that Harriet Bailey worked for, because as far as sexuality was concerned, in the white South, it was open season on black women. And that tragedy is something that haunted Douglass as well.
Slavery does away with fathers as it does away with families. The name of the child is not expected to be that of his father. He may be white, glorying in the purity of his Anglo-Saxon blood, and his child may be ranked with the blackest of slaves. Indeed, he may be, and often is, master to the same child.
Douglass would later write that slavery had made his mother a myth and his father a mystery.
A little nearer to my old masters stood a very long, rough, low building, literally alive with slaves of all ages, conditions, and sizes. They would sometimes sing. They breathed the prayer and complaint of souls boiling over with the bitterest anguish. Every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains.
Well, from Sophia Auld, his mistress in Baltimore at about the age of 10, he receives the gift of words. She teaches him his letters. And for about a year, he is given the freedom to read and continue to inscribe in his booklets. But after about a year, his master, Hugh Auld, her husband, discovers this, in part because it's the law that you're not to teach slaves to read and write, and in part, I suspect, because Hugh Auld was threatened by that. Hugh Auld laid down the law and declared that Douglass shall not be taught to read and write.
Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. If you learn him how to read, he'll want to know how to write. And this accomplished, he'll be running away with himself.
And Douglass later on referred to that as the first anti-slavery lecture he ever heard, because Hugh Auld's analysis was absolutely on target. He was describing what would eventually kill off slavery. It would be when black people came to have the power to articulate their grievances.
150 miles south of Baltimore, a slave named Nat Turner turned the written word into a sword. Preaching that passages from the Bible foretold rebellion, he led a band of slaves against the town of Jerusalem, Virginia, killing 57 white men, women, and children before he was captured and hanged. In the aftermath, southern states passed even stricter laws against slaves learning to read or become...
What happens when you have a rebellion like Nat Turner's rebellion is that the entire countryside, indeed the entire South, is up in arms. And every black man, woman, and child is a target. And the repression is immense. There is death, there is torture, there is fear, there is suspicion. Every black is a rebel.
Douglass is living parallel with Nat Turner. In many ways, he is a marked man, because he is living now in a South that has been highly sensitized to the charismatic leader, to the preacher of the word.
To plan an escape, one had to be extremely careful, and one needed a lot of good friends. One needed to be cunning, crafty, careful. One needed good disguises. Mostly one needed a great deal of courage.
No man can tell the intense agony which is felt by the slave when wavering on the point of making his escape. All that he has is at stake, and even that which he has not is at stake also. The life which he has may be lost, and the liberty which he seeks may not be gained.
You got a right, you got a right to the tree of life. You got a right, you got a right.
In Baltimore, Frederick met Anna Murray, free black woman from the eastern shore of Maryland who worked as a housekeeper and used her savings to help with his escape. Working closely with a secret society that aided fugitive slaves, Frederick devised a careful plan. He would disguise himself as a sailor, using travel papers borrowed from a free seaman. He would travel by train to Havre de Grace, Maryland, then cross the Susquehanna by ferry, take another train to Wilmington, Delaware, and finally board a steamboat to Philadelphia. On September 3rd, 1838, Frederick Bailey, carrying his copy of the Columbian Orator, crossed into freedom.